Hello and welcome to Future Building. I'm Mathew Aitchison and I'm Professor at Monash University and CEO of Building 4.0 CRC, a cooperative R&D hub for the building industry. In this podcast, we take a broad look at buildings and building in contemporary society and what's coming down the pipeline in the future. In upcoming episodes, we'll talk with invited guests and experts in the field where we'll cover news and trends along with research and developments in the industry. Picture the building industry in your mind, and it's almost inevitable that you'll think of a building site. A building site in full flight is usually loud and pretty chaotic. There's stuff everywhere, trucks coming and going, and lots of people in high vis and hard hats. But the transformation of traditional building to industrialized building is also a move to some degree from the building site into the factory. As anyone who's spent some time on a building site would know, it makes a lot of sense to spend less time on site. It rains, things get lost, there's never enough space, and working conditions are often pretty poor. The idea here is pretty simple. Move as much as possible of building activity off-site to increase efficiency, reduce waste, improve quality, and importantly, provide good conditions for workers. Sounds simple, right? Not so fast. From what I have seen, setting up a factory is not a science, it's an art. It's also tricky because it involves expertise rarely found in the traditional building industry. So perhaps it's no surprise then that we look to countries like Japan and Sweden who have some of the most smooth running and well-organized industrial building factories in the world. Our guest today, Dr. Helena Lidelow, is one such expert on building production strategy and operation. Today, we discuss the building blocks of a great production strategy. I first had the pleasure of meeting Helena in 2016 when a colleague and I visited her in Luleå in the far north of Sweden. And at that time, Helena had a joint appointment at Luleå Technical University, where she was associate professor, and at Lindbäcks Bygg, a construction company specializing in industrial house building, where Helena was platform manager and later director of R&D. Our group returned to Lindbäcks again in 2017, and I distinctly recall Helena taking us on a tour of what was, at that time, the most advanced implementation of lean production principles that I'd ever seen applied to building production anywhere in the world, hands down. Since then, Helena has moved on, relocating to California at the beginning of 2022 to take up the role of CTO at Volumetric Building Companies, to bring some of that Swedish knowledge and expertise, as we shall hear in the podcast, back to the United States. A couple of highlights for me in our interview were a discussion of the cyclic business model of building, what makes Sweden so special in the story of industrialized building, and on to the role that AI could play in building in the future. I hope you enjoy our interview as much as I did. I spoke with Helena while she was on holiday in Sweden in July 2023. Helena, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Mathew.
Helena, as we heard in the introduction, you're CTO of the Volumetric Building Company, or VBC, and you've previously held roles at Lindbäcks and Luleå University. Just for listeners who've never come across Lindbäcks or Luleå, perhaps you could just give us a quick overview of those organizations.
Certainly. Luleå University of Technology is situated 2 hours south of the polar circle, so we know what it's like to be in the cold winter. Luleå University has a long tradition of working together with the industry. So ever since the university started in the 70s, the university connection has been strong. And as part of that, I worked in a research group that interested ourselves in industrialized housing. And we built a pretty successful community around that during the 2 first decades of the 2000s. And we went from 2 people to more than 30 surrounding this subject of industrialized construction and working with the companies. And as such, we have also had a lot of exchange and collaboration programs between academia and industry. And I was part of that too. So after more than a decade in this environment, I was asked to join Lindbäcks Bygg. And Lindbäcks Bygg is the largest industrialized housing producer in the Nordics. And they wanted me to start working with them with R&D first. And I ended up as the VP of design. So I was with the company for 12 years, working on setting up the design team and expanding it from 21 people to 45 when I left. And we took on the task to serve not only one, but two factories in industrialized construction, whereof the new factory in Haraholmen is one of the most automated in the world, and has a design capacity of 16 modules per shift. And setting up operations to support that facility was fascinating and challenging.
That's quite a journey into industrialized building. Moving now to your current role as CTO of VBC, or Volumetric Building Companies. What does that role involve, and what was your mandate coming to that company?
The role as CTO is really about securing the technological development over time for VBC to make sure that VBC has all the technology to build the modules it should, how they are constructed, but also not only how they are designed from a code compliance perspective, but foremost, so they are designed for manufacturing and assembly. So me and my team work a lot with production processes and manufacturing setups, factory organization, and process improvement in conjunction with defining and changing the product so we can have precise speed and output from our three facilities.
That's an excellent segue, I guess, into the deeper dive parts of our conversation today, which are around production. Now, I heard you talk in depth about production at Stanford in February, so I've had a bit of a head start, perhaps, than some of our audience here. And there's certainly many, many parts to production. And in a podcast of the length that we're doing today, Helena, we probably can't do them all justice. We might talk about some of the things that you've just mentioned now, whether that's product market fit or the variation between standardized products or highly customized products, platforms, digital physical interactions, all of those things. But zooming in, I guess, on production strategy and some of the things we were just talking about, what do you think the building blocks of a great production strategy are?
Well, first of all, the production strategy does not live in a vacuum. You can't have a production strategy that does not follow and support your business strategy. I see several companies actually fail on that point, where you might have production that's too standardized and you're selling something completely different. Or the other way around, you have production capacity that's very manual and doesn't really have much of a standardization, but what you sell is highly standardized. Both of them situations present a missed opportunity. So I would say the first building block is really a very good alignment with the business strategy. And alignment with business isn't a constant. So that's the second part that I would have as a building block. Over years, and I observed this at Lindbäcks, and I do it now with VBC too, I can see that the production strategy has to be agile. So when we have market change, we have to respond in production. And I had a very good conversation with one of my colleagues at VBC where he said, we're rebuilding production all the time, reconfiguring, changing. We will have to do that every month to either improve, but also to change your setup so it actually follows your business strategy. So I would say that alignment being the first block, and then the continuous conversation being the second block that's important for production strategy. Now, once you have those two, you would take a look at your product. It kind of always starts with what are you going to make, and what is the ramifications of that product? What does it look like? How is it deconstructed when you look at it from a production standpoint? That would be my third block. And then kind of the most interesting question that I also hear several forgetting is how fast do you want to go? And that's another piece that's linked to business strategy. If you tell me that I'm okay producing 2 modules every day or whatever that number might be, I know that I don't have to invest heavily in different types of equipment, and I can do this in a very modest way. But if you come and tell me that, look at this, I have a pipeline that's such and such long, it's 1.5 years long, and we have to produce 8 to 12, even 14 modules per day to be able to fulfill the demand. Now that reflects back on my production strategy immediately, and I need to set myself up for success there. So my fourth component here is speed, or needed speed in production. And that's also the most difficult one because it's always offbeat with what actually happens in the market. So if you set yourself up for producing your 14 or 15 modules per day, you can be pretty sure that the market will then tell you, oh, I don't need that right now because now it's a downturn. And then you'll have to cope with that problem. So it's a changing dynamic for sure.
Helena, can I just dig a little deeper into that question? What can one do when you have that mismatch between the strategy that's been set up and then the market forces that are acting independent of our best laid plans?
Yes, it's a very tough situation. First of all, I think the number one thing is to be prepared for it. This will always happen. So it's a foundational truth in construction that it's a cyclical business. You only need to look at history to understand that it's always gone up and down. So, I mean, you shouldn't be unrealistically poised when you're saying that, okay, I will invest in the most fancy automated factory in the world, and I will have consistent flow through it at all times. It is probably not going to be true. So even when you're pondering your production strategy, this should be an element of the discussion because the context is exactly that. And then when you are in the situation where you're facing this, that, oh my gosh, it's not going to work out, you have to be prepared to react swiftly. Your factory setup and production there is probably the most expensive component you have in your entire company system. And it means that you will need to be a little bit brutal. So in a downturn, you might have to consider, oh, I'm not going to run this full shift now. I might have to go to a half shift. If I have several facilities, one of them would have to stand still. If I can bear it, I need to shed manufacturing equipment. Those are harsh decisions, but it's better to make them than to see your company slowly fade away because it can't really carry the investment.
Yes. So thanks for that. That gives a really good outline of those big building blocks, the foundation, if you like. There's a lot of talk about platforms at the moment in the industry and many different types of platforms, both from a kind of product platform perspective, but also what's broadly referred to as a platform ecosystem where different players are aligned across a common platform, and building production is choreographed, if you like, across that platform. In the work that you've done both at Lindbeck's and now at VBC, I'm just wondering, how do you view platforms and how essential are they to a good production strategy?
Yeah, the marriage between platform and the production strategies is obvious. And I would say once again that this has to do a lot with scale. So let's start there. If you're a smaller company and you're doing business with different customized projects, and you see them changing over time, and you basically take what you get into the business to keep it going and perhaps growing, you should realize that having a platform is an investment. So the investment in having a platform, designing a platform, sustaining a platform is something that carries a cost. And you need to make sure that you have return on investment on that cost. So that's kind of the first business decision that you make around the platform. So let's say then that you are in a position where your company is a little larger and you realize that your projects have a lot of repeat components in them. And you might even have set up your production strategy to make it so. So if your production strategy, for example, contains either automated or semi-automated equipment that gives you certain parameters, those parameters definitely needs to be in the platform. So they become ramifications for the entire business. And I think one of the largest mistakes I've seen when it comes to having a platform is that it sort of lives only in design. It becomes a number of templates that people keep either in Revit or AutoCAD or whatever to repeat the designs over time. But real good platforms actually live outside of design and have a representation also on the factory floor. So your connection for the corners, if we imagine ourselves producing modules right now, they are defined in design, but they are also defined in production. They are trained in production, and you have a tool setup associated with it. Now, if you move further downstream inside your operations, you come to logistics, and then you have made sure that this corner connection, of course, can sustain transportation and that you have the correct amount of fixing space there to handle your wrapping, for example. And if you come to site, then the same could be true if you have walkways or you have balconies. Now that's already designed into the structures. You don't have to think about that. And so for me, the platform is pulling right through all the different groups and functions that you have within a company on the operations side. And it also is very, very well tied to the production strategy. They cannot really exist without each other. So the internal conversation between the two is very strongly linked. And sometimes there are days when you think that they are one and the same.
Helena, on this point, does a platform, sorry, let me back that up a little bit. When we talk today about platforms, almost always the comment that I hear back from industry and or even lay people is that that's a digital platform. Do you see platforms as needing to be digital, or do you see platforms as being better perhaps when they're digital?
I think digitalization is a very handy tool to have. Digital representation is a very good container, and it also has the very nice feature that it can keep versions of your thoughts. So for me, it's natural that a platform is digital. is it needed? Not really, actually. There were platforms before we knew what BIM really was. And the templates that we built, for example, for single-family homes production in Sweden, where I come, during the 60s and 70s, they had never heard of Revit, but they still kept that templates and made sure that we had repetition in whatever we did. So no, you don't need digitalization, but it's very convenient. And I think one of the things that has happened during the decades here is that the amount of information has increased to such a degree that it's difficult for a core group of people to keep everything of that inside their heads. So it's just easy to build, if you will, a memory for the organization and keep the platform in there in a digital representation for everyone to access and share, rather than having it in templates that are more manual.
Yeah, really interesting. Helena, moving to the side a little now, and particularly because I've got you here, I really enjoyed your historical reflections on the interactions between the USA and Sweden in the early 20th century, particularly around the emergence of what we might think of today as the earliest forms of industrialized house building. I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, of course. I take an interest in the Sweden-US interaction, actually because my great-grandmother was born in the US. And she immigrated back, if you will, from the US to Sweden as a very young girl, and then gave birth to my grandfather. So it's a fascinating story, and for that reason, I kind of dive into my own area of expertise and see if there are traces that make sense. And yeah, it turns out that there is. So there's always been a strong exchange between Sweden and US as countries. And it kind of started during the late 1800s, when many Swedes actually had to leave our country. We had a famine, and 1/3 of our population decided to leave the country because we just couldn't sustain ourselves as farmers. And that kind of started a long-standing relationship, also industrially, because this coincided with the late 1800s being a very strong force in industrialization and people moving from the rural parts into the cities. So the urbanization was very strong at the same time. So we had many people going across the Atlantic to see what the New World had to offer and the technological developments that was there. And then they brought it back home. So one of those things were the invention of a module, which was basically an RV in the beginning, where you build a home inside the facility and travel with it to site rather than site erected. And Sweden had, during the early 1900s, a very strong shortage of housing. So the cities, due to this urbanization, became crowded. And it became not only a problem of people not having space, but it also became a sanitary problem. So we had diseases starting, and because it was so difficult to contain all the people. So the government here took an interest, and they started to organize template housing plans. So there were drawings how to construct a healthy home that was issued by our government to support the notion that everyone should have a home to live in, and that home should be healthy and light and have good sanitation. And now, in the wake of a national government supporting this type of movement, the industry awakes. So we have the early panelized industry here in Sweden came just around the closing of World War I. We were part of the World Exhibition that came in 1924, where we presented this, and it became a strong pillar in the industry here, that we, as a country that has a lot of wood, there's a lot of forest in Sweden, and we cut a lot of wood during the early 1900s, and now we figured out that we can build houses in factories with it. So that was very cool. And now the idea of modular, that was born in the US 1929, fit right into this. So when we had delegations from Sweden traveling over just prior to World War II, we discovered that modular is a solution that we can probably implement in our country. Now we had, of course, a war in the way there, but after World War II, this rebuilding of the country and the final solutions to our housing crisis took hold. And for us here, panelization and modularization became very strong components of our own history in starting industrialization and construction. So it was actually part of solving the 1 million homes deficit that was here. And you should remember then that we were lacking 1 million homes at a time when our population was 5 million. So you can understand that this was a really big crisis. And the major result to that crisis was to employ industrialization in construction. So it happened on the wood side, where we have panelized and modularized solutions. And it also happened on the prefab concrete side, where we have a lot of prefab paneling happening. And all of this was supported by the pretty strong industrial culture that Sweden had from having an economy that was untouched by World War II. And then a very strong manufacturing culture around large brands like Volvo and ASEA and Electrolux, who knew how to produce other things and then just ventured into construction and helped solve it. So that's actually where our strong culture comes from. It was born during the 1950s to 70s, and it's still remaining today.
So just for our listeners, the 1 million homes program, that operated in which years?
It was a government decision actually to organize a 1 million homes program, and it was from 1965 to 1975, and it was clearly stated that we will, during this time period of 10 years that we have in front of us, produce 1 million homes, which then on average, of course, is 100,000 homes a year. One should remember that we were already producing upwards of 90,000 a year, so we were well on our way. And the government decided to support this effort then with building codes that were very clear and at the time prescriptive in terms of what solutions you should use to obtain this. And then they also issued the possibility to get loans in terms of constructing buildings that followed these building codes. And that type of interaction between funding and the rules set up around construction has been a theme during the coming decades in more modern versions. Of course, this was very kind of clear that we are only going to allow you to do certain things, and very prescriptive from the government. They have since taken another stance, but at the time it was very effective.
Yeah, I think it remains a really interesting proposition. particularly for a Western democratic country, as to how they can affect, such a large production strategy in a country. I mean, of course, we saw something similar to that in the Eastern Bloc in Europe, with the rollout of millions and millions of houses across the former USSR and Eastern Bloc countries. We haven't seen anything like that in recent times, I guess, in the countries in the West. But if the housing crisis, which seems to have spread across most countries, or at least housing affordability crises, are anything to go by, perhaps we'll see some government involvement or re-involvement in that space to come. Are you seeing anything of that nature in Sweden or in the US at the moment?
I am not. I think the struggle there. We have to remember the time when this happened. This was just after World War II. Much of Europe was non-existent. It was in ruins. So it was very clear that something major had to be done. This is not something that the market forces will be able to handle themselves, because there is not a functioning market. And similar things happen in Japan, where the need for having a place to stay was overriding a lot of the economics that's there around building a company and so forth. So I think as long as we are not in dire need, and dire need being a threat to humanity, I believe we will have the functioning market forces governing how our housing is going to be developed over time. And the signals I'm seeing right now is that is at par or lower than what the market actually needs. And I think it would need to be a crisis of some sort that would spring into action for governments. If that crisis is our climate crisis, or if it is a sanitary problem because of crowded space, or what it is, I don't know.
So clearly the 1 million homes project gave Sweden the impetus to really think a lot about industrialized building. And I think a lot about Sweden when I think about industrialized building. And I recently had one of your colleagues on the podcast, Jerker Lessing, who I know you know. And I would put a similar question to you, Helena, that I put to Jerker, and that's, I wonder if you ever reflect on your own position in the world. And by that, I mean, why do you think it is that Sweden leads the world in, well, I'm saying that. I'm saying that I think Sweden leads the world in the practice and research of industrialized house building. A, would you agree with that? And B, what is it about Sweden that means you are leading, if indeed you agree with that?
Yeah, well, thank you, first of all. That's nice to hear from you. I would guess you can say that we are leading this effort in the sense that we have a high penetration of the methods. We have a very strong and viable ecosystem around industrialized housing. We have been fortunate enough to been through a few cycles, so we've seen this develop and also been consistent around it since just after the Second World War. So it means that we have experience. I have companies here in Sweden that has a history that's over 50 years in this business, and that's worth something when you start looking at well, for example, the happenings I've been reading around about in the UK, where companies struggle to have the business sustained over time and so forth. And the causes for us being in this situation, well, there are a few things that Swedish culture is good at. One of them is that we're we're pretty remote in terms of where we are situated in the world, which means that we are used to making stuff happen ourselves. No one will do it for us, and we're also pretty stubborn for that matter. So when we have an idea, we really don't give up that easily the first or the second or maybe even the third time, if we believe that the idea is right. And you can take a look at a company like Volvo, to take something that is widely recognized. They were extremely early in the safety question. They wanted people to drive safely in cars. And it was even considered a little bit weird that they mattered so much around that question. And now, when we're sitting here, 2023, I'm pretty sure that many people connotate Volvo directly with safe driving and safe car. So it was a very kind of long-term strategy that they started there in the 50s. And much the same with housing. Our climate, being in the very northern parts of the developed world, does not give us very good circumstances to build on site. But we still need a lot of dwellings. So it's natural for us to do it in a factory. Also, Sweden has one of the highest construction costs on site in Europe, which means that everything that we can do, which will decrease that cost, is natural for us. And therefore, automation and going inside a factory just makes sense. There is a cost difference between having construction workers on site as compared to having workers that work in a factory. So, of course, in terms of driving,
really?
So yeah,
it's that's very comprehensive. I think there's obviously a lot of reasons that have coalesced to make Sweden, or to keep Sweden in that position. I guess, thinking about that, do you now see any other countries or even companies who can surpass, I think, what you and your colleagues have achieved in Sweden?
Oh, I'm pretty sure over time that will happen. I don't think that we will keep a leading position for forever. I can really now already understand that Japan is probably ahead of us, and just haven't been as open and outspoken as we have been. That's another portion of the Swedish culture, is that we're so few on planet Earth, so we have no choice but to collaborate with all others. So it's been an endeavor that's also kind of revolved around openness. When I worked here in Sweden, I often had conversations with competing companies around different types of issues, and we were able to find a good collaborative vibe around questions that we knew were not determining who got what project and how the business was run, but rather, okay, we have fire detailing issues. Shouldn't we sit down and resolve that together? Because we're too small to approach it one by one. So this type of collaboration has also been part of that vibe, and that has, of course, translated to research, where that collaborative effort also has been helpful in building our ecosystem.
And I can testify for those listening that maybe have never had the pleasure of going to Sweden, that the openness and collaboration of which Helena speaks is indeed very, very true, and something which I and my colleagues have profited from very many times. So it's been absolutely amazing. Helena, moving to wrapping up now, obviously today in our conversation, we've focused a lot on production, strategic thinking, the position of Sweden in this history and how that's worked. I guess I am also keen to ask you what idea or technology or what knowledge in the building industry currently do you see as being undervalued, or what do you think we could focus more on that's perhaps escaped the attention of people who really care about these things like you and I do?
Well, yeah, that's an interesting question. So if I knew the answer, I would probably be rich. So I don't know the answer then.
Well, that's the subtitle of this podcast,
Yeah.
Helena, is how to get rich quick in the building
Yes.
industry.
I think one of the notions that we are still fiddling with, but I really can see how that could empower us, is the AI and all that artificial intelligence development that's happening right now. I don't know that we have figured out the true power of this, but I can see how that can be very functional when you have a platform, because platform offers something that AI needs. AI needs a training set to function really well. It needs to understand what is the rule of this context, and now I can propose a solution for you. And I think a platform environment with a clear production strategy really gives you that. So I'm very curious as to what will happen with that and how it can support our industry. And that's where my head is at when I'm thinking about what will I do tomorrow in my homework.
Excellent. Yeah, that's a great insight. Finally, I feel like I can never properly end an episode of this podcast without asking what you think is coming down the pipeline in the building industry for the next 5 or 10 years. What does the future look like in your mind, Helena?
I think the future looks pretty appealing and bright. I mean, the basic foundational things are there for a successful application of platforms and industrialized housing. And by that, I mean that we have many countries where we have a housing crisis or a housing deficit that's too much to be just handled by normal operations. So that's a strong driving force to doing something. There is also another crisis that really bugs me, and that's the climate crisis and the challenges we face in knowing that my granddaughter might not have a world to live in that resembles the one I live in, and that greatly disturbs me as a person. But it also motivates me to be part of this industry, because I know for a fact that if you look at the carbon footprint, for example, on the modular home that we're building inside a factory, it can be as much as 40% lower than what the industry standard is today. So for me, that's a strong driving force towards doing something at scale that really can address the housing crisis we have. So I also look forward to doing more diversification in this market space, to be able to offer different types of business models when it comes to how do you buy buildings, dwellings, and homes, because there are unexplored areas here that could be very beneficial if we unlock some of the communication that needs to happen there. I also want to see a development where prescriptive codes are amended with performance-based codes, and we are able to innovate more in this space, because the housing demand that's there require us to offer many solutions. So sometimes when I speak to people, they kind of shake their head and look at me and say, well, you're one of those who wants everything to look the same. And I'm very, no, I really do not want that. But what I do want is a plethora of offerings from many companies. So you can get what you need for your site, but you allow the companies to specialize in whatever they are good at.
Yeah. Well, I think that's an excellent prognosis for the future, like achieving the scale that we all believe that industrialized building can, investigating these new business models and new opportunities that are out there, thinking differently about the way codes are used and regulation more generally to incentivize innovation, and then thinking more generally about how all of the different products we use can be can have greater variety to meet the needs of people moving forward in a better way that's generous to the planet and to our climate. So on that note, Helena, I would thank you for your time today. It's been an absolute pleasure as always. For our listeners, notes and references will be added online to the show notes. Thank you for listening, and thank you once again, Helena, for a really interesting discussion.
Thank you so much, Matthew. It was a true pleasure. And everyone out there,